Now that we have all our lights set up, it's time to start preparing to render to disk. So there's a few steps that you've got to go through. Oftentimes you might have like a mental checklist. I know people actually make real checklists. There's lots of little things that are very easy to forget. So you want to make sure you go through your scene first of all and make sure that you've optimized it as much as you can. That just involves making sure that you have gotten rid of any kind of geometry that you don't need. Like for instance, if you had a bunch of furniture in a room that you don't see, go ahead and prune that. You know, make sure that you are very aggressive at getting rid of stuff that you don't need. The key though is that you want to make sure that you're not breaking continuity in your sequence. So let's just say you had a big red, beanbag chair in the corner here, and the light was bouncing off that red beanbag chair and bouncing up onto your wall. If you don't see it in this particular camera view because you have a wall blocking it, but you should see the red bouncing onto the wall, then you risk a continuity error if you prune that out. So you would need to keep that beanbag chair so that it bounces light around the room. So that's one thing to consider. And basically at this point, you would start doing some test rendering. You would make sure you go through your scene. So once things are optimized, make sure that each of your shots has the proper optimizations. So for instance, if we have a prune node for shot 1020, you can see here, I'm pruning that remote control light. But if I go to shot 1040, you can see now I'm pruning the kitchen lights as well, because that shot we are looking just down at this carpet. We don't need any lights back here. So that's one thing that you can do. And again, for each one of these shots, I did not do this, but I probably should at some point. Like for instance, for shot 1040, right? Let's just remind you what that shot is. Shot 1040, we're looking down at the pages on the ground, right? So we really don't need anything. I mean, we could get rid of all the pictures on the walls, definitely everything in the kitchen. Again, you might keep things like the sofa and the big furniture around just so that it's casting shadows. But yeah, normally you would go through and delete as much of those things as you need to. I'm going to point out this little thing here. This is an ArnoldObjectSettings just for the carpet, right? So if you have any path here and you're wondering, what is this object? You can right click on it, select selected paths in the scene graph. And now if I go to their scene explorer, you'll see, well, this is the rug. And so what am I doing for the rug here? Just setting some displacements specifically for this shot where I needed to change the subdivisions. This is something really large. I wouldn't normally go up this high on the iterations for sub D, but this has a really fine displacement map that needs to resolve all the little pile on the carpet. So that's what that is. So let's move on to render settings. Again, if you're going to be rendering out to disk, this is where you would set your resolution. All right, so then our Arnold global settings, this is probably the most important node. I have one set up globally for the entire shot, but oftentimes I will have one of these in each individual pass because sometimes you'll actually be changing the settings or the sampling per pass. In fact, there's an iMask pass we'll talk about later where I could probably drastically reduce some of these or change some of these settings. But for now, let's talk about the global sampling settings, right? I'm going to use adaptive sampling, anti-aliasing samples, minimum of 3. That is, I think that's just a default. It's not going to do less than this, right? So it's 3 by 3, so 9 samples per pixel. And then with adaptive sampling turned on, you get this adaptive samples max, and this defaults to 20. Now, this gives you very, very clean renders, but it takes a long time. So when I was test rendering this scene at full resolution with 20 AA samples, the environment for some of my shots, like for instance, for this shot, when I did a test render, it took about 2.5 hours to render that frame on my machine. And I've got a pretty decent CPU, but 2.5 hours, if I was going to render this sequence just on my home computer, 200 frames at 2.5 hours, you're talking probably weeks to get that rendered, right? So you got to optimize this as much as possible. And so for now, I'm going down to 5. That's pretty low, generally pretty noisy. I did a test render earlier. Yeah, you can see a little bit of it here. So this chunk here before I canceled it, I think I've got another one here. This render here is at half resolution with 5 AA samples. So it's still pretty noisy, but this would be, a good preview quality if I was trying to render out the sequence just to get an idea of how animation was playing out during the sequence. So we'll stick with that for now. Now under lighting, environment, this is where you would put a volume shader if you had a volume. Say we're gonna have a little bit of fog or atmosphere in here. You would wanna make sure you've got a local material for volume. This is just a Arnold volume shader with the atmosphere volume selected. And then you would put like a really, really small number, like 0.000, maybe 3 or 4 zeros and then a 1. I highly recommend, by the way, that you don't render the atmosphere or volume in the same pass as the characters and environment. We always end up setting up a separate pass to render that. If we go down to miscellaneous settings, so I've set a bucket size of 32. The default is 64. And the reason I set it to 32 was for a lot of my iteration, I found if you have bigger buckets, but then you have an item that's very small and has a lot of detail, what will happen is your buckets will kind of hit everything else, but then you'll have one bucket that's like hanging out on your eyeball or something like that. And it's just not as efficient because now you've got one thread on your CPU that you're waiting on, right? So if you go to a smaller bucket size, then maybe you've got that one bucket is now 4 buckets. And so you've got 4 threads on your CPU rendering that same amount of space. So there's always that trade-off as far as, you know, bucket size versus the scene. Threads, this is only because I'm recording this course and I need to keep some of my CPU threads. And so normally I think this is -1. So it keeps 1 thread and uses the rest of them. When it's doing disk renders, it's actually using all the threads. So this threads here is actually for interactive renders. And then the texture system, I showed you this earlier. This is just if you had texture maps that were non.tx files, then you would need to have this turned on for Arnold to auto convert those. And we would have run into that error if we hadn't turned this on already because we were using an HDRI texture for the sky. That is pretty much all I've set up. There's lots of other things that we could set in here. All right, so let's get down into passes, right? So we've got our character pass, and just a quick reminder, for our character pass, we're setting some Arnold object settings, right? So we've got a matte flag. So this is the matte checkbox here, and this is being set on a number of items of our environment. So basically the environment is being set to matte when we render our characters. So we should just see our characters cut out, and then for instance, the chair will be cutting out his hand and stuff like that. And this is useful also for the floor because oftentimes the feet are standing on the floor. They might be penetrating just slightly. So you want to have the floor set to matte usually. And then over here, we've got our environment pass. And then instead of setting the characters to matte, which is one way that you could do it, I've actually set them to have camera visibility off. And so that is, again, an Arnold object settings. We set a ray flag here for AI ray camera and turn that off. And then this is being assigned to our 2 characters and the animated objects group, which is part of the environment. But that includes the papers, they're in the remote control. I think that's pretty much it. Now, again, if you were to set this to matte instead, then it just changes the way that you have to comp it back together. So what that means is you would have to add. So instead of overing it, you would add them. There's some advantages to doing that because if you're rendering an environment with your characters set to matte, then wherever the character is going to just be a black holdout, right? And so then you're not going to be paying to render the environment where the character is going to cover it up. And so that's actually a bit more efficient as far as render times, but I'm used to actually comping the characters over top of the background. And so in that case, I just leave it set to camera visibility off. You will pay to render that. It's just the way I've traditionally comped it. So either way works. I'm going to get into this in a later chapter, and then I've already covered our wedge test. So really we only have 2 passes here. So at this point we would start doing some test rendering. And then you would want to examine closely what those test renders look like. So for now, I've got these interactive render filters up here. So I want to render with AOVs, whatever sampling I've got set up here. Let's go ahead and launch renders. By the way, before you launch renders, it's always a good idea to save your file, right? Okay, so let's go start multiple renders. Just our char and our env pass for all 5 shots. Set this to local machine. So now this is going to take quite a while, right? So we're launching 10 renders with higher quality samples. So if I launch this, it's going to take quite a bit of time. You get the idea though. You're going to want to either render it out this way interactively or actually render to disk. For now, I'm going to just do interactive renders. Let's go ahead and launch those. I'll close this window. Go to our catalog. You can see our 10 renders are all queued up here. Let's come back when those are a little bit further along. Now I decided to cancel those renders midway because I know what this looks like already with that level of sampling from this pass. But anyway, the whole point is that you're going to make sure that your passes are working, that there's no errors. You know, you would normally let this resolve so that you've got a higher quality render to look at and make sure that everything is looking perfect. I want to talk about this pass structure. So we've got char and we have env. I can tell you that oftentimes your character assets are being iterated upon more than your environment. And so sometimes it's nice to be able to re-render your character and not have to pay to render the entire scene. Like for instance, you have a really heavy environment scene. You don't want to render it very often. You know, oftentimes the environment is the heaviest part. So say you've got a scene like this and it takes 2 or 3 hours a frame or something. You don't want to be paying to re-render this whole thing because your animators updated the way the character's eyes are twitching or something like that, right? So you want to be able to iterate on re-rendering the character without having to pay, right? So that's one reason. Another reason is for things like depth of field. So oftentimes we'll be doing depth of field in the comp rather than in render. And so a scene like this, for example, you can just kind of catch a glimpse of our background character's leg in this pass, right? This is a shot where I would normally split up the foreground character from the background character. And in a shot like this, I might even just decide to render that background character with the environment because, you know, it's mostly hidden by this character anyway. But if you have 2 characters in your scene, it's often useful to render them separately. So a shot like this, I would likely either have 2 character passes and an environment, or I would include the background character with the environment. For this shot, they're rendered together. Because they're interacting with each other and one character is reaching over the other character and then is behind it, this is where it's often useful to render them together. So this would be a case where one character pass is adequate and then you have the environment behind it. Now in this shot here, this is our character's papers and hands, and it's just going over top of this carpet here. This is a shot where I would probably render everything together. Either that, or I would actually render the papers with the carpet and then I would render the hands separately if I needed to. Or you just render it all together, either way. Now for this shot, again, this is our character. I would probably keep him separated. He's in front of the chair, so I would probably either render the chair separately and then the environment, or I'd render the chair with the environment. Either way, it's fine. Now in this shot, the characters don't actually overlap each other, so I think having them both in one character pass is perfectly fine. We'll save on some footage on disk. Even though this character is in front of this character in 3D space. So if you're doing depth of field, maybe you're putting him out of focus, or maybe you're doing a rack focus. But having this space lets you keep both of these together. If this character was overlapping with this character slightly, like say he was half behind him, then I would definitely split this into 2 character passes.